I promise not to talk for too long. I'm under 10 minutes. So I'm Michael. I'm a PhD student based within the School of Justice at QUT Law. I'm going to be presenting on the topic of the contested legitimacy of encryption backdoors. Really tonight I want to make 3 brief points. And the first is that not all surveillance is necessarily unjust. However, there are certainly conditions where we can judge a particular surveillance system or a surveillance law as being unjust, as being illegitimate, as provoking moral indignation. And therefore, we can use that knowledge, or I hope we can use that knowledge, to try and motivate political resistance to unjust surveillance laws. This is part of, by the way, this is connected to my ongoing PhD research project. So my thinking about this topic is constantly evolving, just as a bit of a waiver. Okay, to understand the idea of legitimate authority, I think first we need to go back and think of the role of power within the surveillance society. So the surveillance state, or the surveillance society, is inherently characterized by an imbalance of power. And it's the imbalance of power between the state, the corporate sector, and the citizen, right? You can think of them as the audience, the agent, and the subject of surveillance. This fits quite neatly into this idea of the panopticon. If you've read any Jeremy Bentham, any Michel Foucault, you'll probably be aware of the metaphor of the panopticon, which kind of characterizes this idea that surveillance puts us all in a mental jail, right? It deters certain behaviors, and it's this complete relationship of domination between the state and the citizen. Now, more recent thinking about this idea challenges that notion that it is a complete relationship of domination. And you can see this visual model I've got up on the board. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into it in detail, but it's taken from the work of Gary Marks, and he argues that it's not just a unidirectional relationship, right? So it is bidirectional, and even the comparatively powerless have the capacity to resist the powerful, even in a surveillance society. And you can see this reflected in some of the political campaigns, some of the stuff we've been talking about tonight. Yeah, good. Some of the stuff we've been talking about tonight. And you can also see it in the quantitative measures of our use of certain technologies after specific events. So you can see here, the use of Tor skyrocketed immediately after the Snowden revelations. It's still sustained about a 2-fold increase since then, even though it's gone back down. You can see how search interest in virtual private networks in Australia has peaked and has sustained about a 2-fold interest since the introduction of mandatory metadata retention legislation. So citizens have the capacity to experience moral indignation, and that is reflected in their political action, right? But it's not enough. The imbalance of power, I don't think, is enough to provoke moral indignation, to get people to actually do something. This is kind of a theme we've had discussed throughout the night. It's only where power is recognized as not being legitimate that it offends our moral senses and motivates political action. So what are the characteristics that determine whether or not a surveillance relationship between the state and the citizen are legitimate or not? I think we can look at an example of where surveillance is recognized as legitimate and see how this relationship works. You think of a relatively uncontroversial one is the relationship between a physician and their patient. So you recognize the legitimacy of a physician monitoring the health metrics of their patient because you recognize the source of that authority being in scientific knowledge, because the physician presumably has a medical degree, so they're recognized as being qualified. They have the consent of the patient, and most importantly, it is recognized that that relationship serves a common interest. It serves the interest of the patient. What this tells us, and particularly this from the work of David Beetham, this suggests that if you want to convince the comparatively powerless, the citizens, that they should be contesting the legitimacy of surveillance, you need to demonstrate that the imbalance of power between the state and the citizen does not serve the common interest. When these arguments are happening in the real world, I think it ultimately comes back to a discussion of what is in the common, what serves the common good. How might we use this knowledge to motivate political resistance, more political resistance to unjust surveillance laws? Well, I won't go through this in detail because it's been discussed several times tonight anyway. But we don't actually know what the government's proposing. So this is all up in the air at this point anyway, right? We don't know what form these backdoors to encryption are actually going to take. and I would also know one thing that hasn't been said is that the international legislation that George Brandis has argued we're going to model our laws after, they've passed the laws in New Zealand and the UK, but they still don't know what that law actually requires. We don't know if it requires a vulnerability built into encryption. We don't know if it means to compel technology companies to retain encryption keys. We just don't know. And they don't know in New Zealand or the UK either. But if we're talking about motivating resistance, we can talk about two competing moral claims, right? We can talk about how the government is arguing they have a right to read encrypted communications, and digital rights advocates, we're arguing that citizens have a right to the privacy of their encrypted communications. So let's analyze the debate thus far. This is just a very quick pulled together of some of the statements that the Prime Minister has made and some NGOs have made. The government has generally argued that their authority to intercept these messages is justified by reference to the rule of law. I think Scott was talking about lawful access earlier. Turnbull and Brandis love that term. They argue that we need to reinstate the rule of law in cyberspace. They talk about an imbalance of power between the state and criminals. And they don't talk about how they're actually going to redress that imbalance of power. They're not giving us specifics. It's a common strategy where the powerful legitimate the laws, the rules that they're trying to argue for by equating lawfulness with normative justification. That is, if it's legal, it's the right thing to do. In contrast, digital rights advocates, they've argued that, or they've contested legitimacy, sorry, by focusing on the power imbalance between the state and the citizen. They've argued that it has negative impacts for personal privacy, and they've highlighted the negative consequences for cybersecurity more generally. Broadly speaking, we can say this is a microcosm of the broader digital surveillance debate, and that debate between the competing values of liberty and security, right? And security tends to win when these two come up against each other, again, as other people have said tonight. But why is that always the case? How can we motivate people to experience moral outrage and actually get people to do something, to talk to politicians, to participate in public consultation? I said before, and this is part of my PhD research, it's still something I'm trying to answer myself. I'm trying to understand the structure of the arguments that digital rights activists are making, and explore how our knowledge of legitimate authority might be used to actually motivate more action, to get people to do something. I do think that the Achilles heel of the government's argument of the legitimation process, it has to do with how the common good is being constructed. And to effectively contest this legitimacy of encryption backdoors, of metadata retention, whatever the surveillance law you're thinking of, we need to reframe the debate between privacy and security. And this is building on some work I've done with some of my other QT colleagues, but what I think we need to do is argue that privacy is a collective good and that it contributes to cybersecurity more broadly, right? They're not mutually exclusive values, they reinforce one another. Instead of reducing the discussion of privacy to a right to non-interference by the state, it needs to be something that is inherently tied to security. This is not an easy process to do because, as it has been explored, right, the government, those in power, benefit. They benefit from a process of self-legitimation. That is that those in power get to determine the rules or the context within which these debates are happening. But even though it is difficult, I think we can articulate a message about the virtue of privacy, of serving the common good, of privacy serving the interests of cybersecurity, and the importance of privacy for the broader health of democracy itself. I also think, and this is just a thought bubble I've had, that we should take the debate about the rule of law up to the government and say, yes, we should have the rule of law in cyberspace. But that means that we have to define the rights and duties, not just of the citizens, but of the state itself. What are the boundaries of the state's power over the citizen in cyberspace? That's what having the rule of law in cyberspace requires. And I think that this can complement the already existing strong arguments that are being made about the negative consequences for cybersecurity of encryption backdoors in an empirical sense, that this type of policy does not serve the standards of evidence-based policy as well, which the war on mathematics, that whole movement, I think, is brilliant. So thank you for listening to me ramble for a couple of minutes. As I said, this is an ongoing project. I would like to show my PhD just a little bit. If any of you are interested in participating in a research interview to just have a discussion about your thoughts about the legitimate authority of the state in cyberspace, please contact me. Just send me an email, contact me via Twitter. I am very eager to hear other people's views on this topic as well. Thank you very much.